You know, when we usually think about a massive building collapsing, we picture this sudden, dramatic event.
Right, like an earthquake.
Yeah, an earthquake, or maybe a wrecking ball, a massive storm. The cause is external, it's highly visible, and, the mechanics of why it fell are just incredibly obvious to anyone watching.
There's this undeniable cause and effect.
Yeah.
A force hits the structure, and the structure fails.
Exactly. But consider a building that looks completely fine from the outside. Maybe it even looks a little imposing.
Okay.
But then, on a random Tuesday, it just folds in on itself. No earthquake, no storm.
It just drops.
It simply collapses because for decades, termites have been quietly eating away at the foundation. They've been hollowing out every single load-bearing beam from the inside out until there is absolutely nothing left to hold the roof up.
That is a very grim picture.
It is, but that is exactly what the data in the massive stack of sources you shared with us today tells us is happening to Iran in 2026.
Yeah, it really is.
So welcome to our deep dive. We are looking at reports ranging from IMF and World Bank data to these really deep analyses from the Washington Institute, the Carnegie Endowment, and the Wall Street Journal.
It's a huge stack of research.
It really is. And our mission today is to unpack the systemic collapse of Iran's economy. Because while the headlines constantly focus on geopolitics and foreign policy,
Which they always do.
right, always, the true story buried in these sources is this fascinating, tragic case study of what happens when a country's institutions just rot from the inside out.
It really serves as a masterclass in how intertwined political and institutional failures can systematically dismantle a nation. A nation that honestly, genuinely possesses immense potential.
Absolutely. Now, before we jump into those numbers, I do want to clarify something for you listening.
Good idea.
The sources you provided contain, politically charged content regarding the Iranian regime, its leaders, and international relations.
They definitely do.
So we're not taking any sides or endorsing any political viewpoints today. Our job is simply to impartially convey the facts, the data, and the analyses contained in that original source material you shared with us.
Right, we are looking at the mechanics here, not the politics.
Exactly. So let's set the scene, because the macroeconomic numbers for Iran in 2026 are just staggering.
They're hard to even comprehend.
I mean, we are looking at an IMF projection of a 6.1% contraction in GDP.
Wow.
And we're looking at a 68.1% contraction in GDP.
Wow.
And we are looking at a 68.9% consumer price inflation rate.
Which is just crushing for everyday people.
Crushing. And in 2025, the national currency, the rial, lost 84% of its value. That pushed the free market exchange rate toward an unbelievable 1.5 million to the dollar.
Yeah, 1.5 million. It's crazy.
So it is so easy to look at those numbers and just assume, well, the international sanctions are solely responsible for this level of devastation.
Right. I mean, it is the easiest assumption to make.
Yeah.
But attributing this crisis solely to sanctions really misses the actual architecture of the problem.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, look, sanctions are undeniably devastating. I mean, they have frozen access to over $100 billion in foreign reserves.
Right.
And they've isolated the country from the swift global banking network.
Which basically cuts them off from the world.
Exactly. However, the sources consistently describe this not as a temporary sanction-induced shock, but as a deeply entrenched structural crisis.
I want to dig into that term, structural crisis. What makes it structural? Like, if the sanctions were lifted tomorrow, wouldn't the economy just bounce back?
No, it really wouldn't. And to understand why it wouldn't bounce back, we have to look at the legacy of what economists call a rentier state.
A rentier state. Okay.
Right. So for decades, Iran's economy relied overwhelmingly on oil revenues.
The rents.
Exactly. The rents. They relied on them to fund government operations. And when a state gets its money from exporting a natural resource rather than taxing a productive domestic workforce,
Things change.
the dynamic between the government and the people completely changes.
How so?
Well, the state becomes the ultimate distributor of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't need to foster domestic innovation or, protect property rights because it can just write checks from oil sales.
So instead of the government relying on the taxpayers for revenue,
Right.
which, naturally makes the government accountable to the public,
Exactly. It flips.
the taxpayers rely on the government for survival. That breeds a massive dependency.
It breeds massive dependency, and it actively discourages economic diversification.
Wow. Okay.
So you combine that oil dependency with an authoritarian model that fundamentally prioritizes its own political survival and security over technocratic efficiency.
Right.
And you build a low-growth, high-inflation trap.
Ah, I see.
The sanctions didn't build that trap. They just locked the door once the economy was already inside.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if we go back to the building analogy, it sounds like blaming a leaking roof for a house collapse, when the real problem is that the foundation was eaten by termites decades ago.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
The sanctions are the rainstorm, but the termites did the actual structural damage.
Yeah. And to truly understand the condition of that foundation, we have to look at who actually owns the house.
Okay, who owns it?
Well, in Iran, the formal civilian government, the ministries, the parliament, the entities supposed to be running the country.
Right, the official government.
They are practically insolvent. They are struggling to pay basic bills.
Wow.
But sitting right beside them,
Yeah.
operating in the exact same country, is a parallel parastatal economy.
A parallel economy.
Yes, and it is absolutely thriving, and it is largely unaccountable.
The sources refer to this as the military boneyard complex. And I actually read through this section twice because the scale of the shadow economy it's just difficult to comprehend.
It is massive.
We are talking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and these entities called boneyards, which are religious foundations.
Right, and the history of these boneyards is crucial here.
Walk me through it.
They were originally established, or at least greatly expanded, after the 1979 revolution as charitable foundations.
Okay, charities.
Yeah. Their mandate was to manage confiscated assets and help the poor. But over the decades, without any real regulatory oversight, they morphed into these massive commercial monopolies.
But they didn't just grow organically, though. Like, they grew through this massive legal loophole. Can you explain the reinterpretation of Article 44?
Yeah, this is key. So in the mid-2000s, the government attempted to liberalize the economy by reinterpreting Article 44 of the Iranian constitution.
Okay.
The stated goal was to encourage the privatization of state-owned enterprises.
Which sounds good on paper.
Right. In a normal, healthy economy, you sell all those state-run companies to private entrepreneurs. That stimulates competition, it builds a free market, and it broadens your tax base.
But instead of true privatization, about 80% of these state assets were just swallowed up by the IRGC and the boneyards.
Exactly, 80%.
That's wild. So the state essentially transferred its own wealth to its military and religious foundations under the guise of free market reform.
They did, and the scale is breathtaking. I mean, the IRGC Cooperation Boneyard, for example, they now control vast swaths of telecommunications, massive agricultural operations.
It's huge chunks of the economy.
Yeah, and they hold a 45% stake in the Baumann Group, which is a major auto manufacturer.
Wait, I need to stop you there because the sources point out that about 40% of the entire Iranian economy is completely tax exempt.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's basically a country with two separate circulatory systems, but one of them is a vampire draining the other.
That's exactly what it is.
If the civilian government is legally prohibited from taxing nearly half the economy, and arguably the most profitable half that owns the telecom and auto sectors, how does the math work?
It doesn't.
How do they keep the lights on in the civilian ministries?
Well, often they don't.
Yeah.
And that is where the system begins cannibalizing itself. Operating completely outside of public tax oversight creates this playground for cronyism. This isn't just about lost tax revenue. It's about active extraction.
Extraction, like stealing from the state.
Essentially. The sources highlight the Yas Holdings scandal from 2017 to illustrate this.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that.
Yeah. So Yas Holding was a major subsidiary of the IRGC Cooperative Foundation. An internal audit leaked that billions of dollars, billions, funds that were supposedly earmarked for vital military operations, they had simply been embezzled by regime elites and funneled into private luxury real estate projects.
Oh, wow. So the wealth isn't just trapped in these tax-exempt foundations. It is being actively siphoned out of the country's productive capacity.
Exactly.
But this brings me back to my question about the civilian government. If they can't collect taxes from the biggest corporations and they're cut off from international borrowing because of the sanctions,
Right.
What mechanism do they use to pay the millions of civil servants and keep the state running?
They are forced to rely on the only lever they have left. They force the central bank to just print money.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The civilian government's lack of tax revenue leads directly to the catastrophic collapse of the Iranian banking sector. It has essentially become an off-budget printing press for the politically connected.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because let's talk about the mechanics of that. The failure of Ayanda Bank in late 2025 is a perfect case study of how this works in practice.
It really is.
This wasn't some small regional credit union making a few bad bets. It was founded by a highly connected tycoon, and their business model, frankly, seemed to defy the basic laws of finance.
Defy is a good word for it.
To lure in millions of everyday depositors, they offered the highest interest rates in the country.
But, a bank has to generate massive returns to pay out those exorbitant interest rates.
Right, that's just basic banking.
But Ayanda didn't do that. Instead, they borrowed astronomically from the central bank. And then, instead of investing that borrowed money into productive industries that might actually yield a real return,
They blew it.
they blew nearly $5 billion on toxic loans and speculative luxury real estate.
$5 billion.
Yeah. Most notably, they spent it on the massive Iran Mall in Tehran.
Which is just wild. When a bank burns through $5 billion on a luxury mall, eventually the math catches up.
It always does.
And when Ayanda inevitably faced total collapse, the government was terrified of a public bank run. But they didn't let the bank fail and liquidate the assets, did they?
No, they didn't.
They merged Ayanda into a state-owned bank and simply printed trillions of rials to cover the massive hole in the balance sheet.
Which brings us to a terrifying statistic in the IMF report.
What's that?
The report warns that Iranian commercial banks currently hold a dismal 4.9% capital to assets ratio.
Oh my God.
And furthermore, the public pension system is functionally insolvent.
Okay, for our listeners who don't spend their weekends reading central bank stress tests, what does a 4.9% capital to assets ratio actually mean if there is a run on the bank tomorrow?
Well, think of capital as a bank's financial shock absorber.
Okay.
If a bank lends out $100 but only has $4.90 in actual capital backing those loans up,
That's nothing.
the margin for error is virtually non-existent. If even a small percentage of those borrowers default, the bank is instantly underwater. It is insolvent.
Oh.
Now, in a healthy financial system, regulators step in long before a bank hits that point.
Right, to stop the bleeding.
But in Iran, the central bank lacks the political authority to rein in these well-connected, shielded banks. They literally cannot stop the printing presses.
It's like playing Monopoly, but the banker is allowed to just draw new money on napkins whenever their friends go bankrupt.
Yeah, that's incredibly accurate.
It ruins the game for everyone else because printing trillions of reals to cover bad mall investments, it doesn't create any actual wealth.
Not at all.
It just drastically increases the supply of money chasing the same amount of goods. And that dilutes the value of the money already sitting in ordinary people's pockets.
Exactly. That is the engine driving the 68.9% hyperinflation.
And so how does this hyperinflation affect the physical day-to-day resources of the country?
Well, this financial abstraction has devastating physical consequences. The monetary rot bleeds directly into the mismanagement of the country's physical resources.
Because they can't afford to fix anything.
Right, because the formal state is broke and the parallel economy is focused strictly on extracting short-term profit, the country literally cannot maintain its basic infrastructure.
I want to pivot to those physical resources because it leads to paradoxes that are honestly almost hard to wrap your head around.
They really are.
I mean, Iran sits on the second largest natural gas reserves in the entire world.
The second largest.
Yet the sources highlight that during the winter, the country suffers from crippling, widespread gas shortages. How does a country freeze when it is sitting on an ocean of fuel?
Because extracting, processing, and transmitting that natural gas requires immense, continuous investment in infrastructure.
Which they aren't doing.
No. They haven't been able to attract foreign investment due to the sanctions, and the domestic funds are either squandered or funneled into that parastatal economy we talked about.
So the grids are just failing.
They haven't upgraded their extraction grids at all. So to keep the electrical grids from failing completely during the winter freeze, power stations are forced to burn a heavy, incredibly toxic fuel oil known as mazout.
And the downstream effects of burning mazout are staggering. I mean, it creates smog so thick and toxic that schools in major Iranian cities are forced to close for up to 50 days a year.
Yeah, 50 days.
The air becomes literally unbreathable. And yet, the mismanagement of the country's water supply might actually be even worse.
Oh, the water crisis is a direct result of the institutional structure we've been discussing.
How so?
Well, the engineering arm of the IRGC, Katamal and Bia, they act as what the sources describe as a water mafia.
Well, water mafia.
Yeah. They monopolized the lucrative contracts for dam construction and massive water diversion projects.
But they aren't building these dams based on environmental studies or, actual public need, are they?
No, not at all. They prioritized directing that diverted water to politically favored, highly water-intensive, heavy industries.
Like the steel plants.
Exactly, steel plants located in arid central provinces. They blatantly ignore the ecological limits of the region just to secure industrial output for their own conglomerates.
This isn't just a minor environmental concern, it is apocalyptic.
It really is.
I mean, President Pezeshkian actually issued a stark warning in late 2025 that Tehran, the capital city housing millions of people, might literally need to be evacuated due to acute water shortages.
An entire capital city.
Yes. And yet, his administration's official advice to citizens suffering from the winter gas shortages was simply to wear warm clothes indoors.
Is tone deaf.
Completely tone deaf. And at the exact same time, the state is spending $6 billion a year to import subsidized gasoline because they price it so artificially low that domestic consumption is out of control.
Right. The state is trapped in a classic subsidy paradox.
Explain that paradox.
Well, subsidizing basic goods like gasoline and food drains the national treasury, and it heavily incentivizes massive cross-border smuggling networks.
Right, because it's so cheap inside the country.
Exactly. But the alternative, which is removing those subsidies, means unleashing the full violent force of that 68.9% inflation on a population whose wages are completely stagnant.
And we saw the immediate consequences of trying to remove that buffer in January 2026.
We did.
President Pezeshkian attempted to rip the Band-Aid off by removing the preferential exchange rates used to import essential food items.
Right.
Can you explain the mechanics of how a preferential exchange rate was keeping food prices down and why removing it caused such chaos?
Sure. So a preferential exchange rate means the government allows approved importers to buy U.S. dollars at an artificially cheap price.
Okay.
A price far below the actual free market street value of the real. The importer uses those cheap dollars to buy wheat or medicine abroad, which theoretically keeps the cost low for the Iranian consumer at the grocery store.
Makes sense.
But it costs the government billions to subsidize that difference.
Oh.
So when the treasury runs dry and Pezeshkian cuts off those cheap dollars, importers suddenly have to buy currency at the collapsed street rate of 1.5 million irals to the dollar.
And they pass that astronomical cost directly to the consumer.
Exactly.
The immediate result was a spike in food inflation to 73% almost overnight.
Overnight.
But let me challenge the timeline here. Didn't Mahmoud Ahmadinejad attempt this exact same kind of subsidy shock therapy back in 2010?
He did, yeah.
Why did his administration manage to somewhat pacify the public then, while Pezeshkian's 2026 attempt is blowing up in their faces and triggering massive social unrest?
The context of state wealth is the key differentiator here. In 2010, the Ahmadinejad administration replaced the removed subsidies with direct, universal cash handouts to citizens.
Like a universal basic income kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. And because the state was still generating massive oil revenues at the time, those cash handouts actually increased the purchasing power of the poorest Iranians in the short term.
So they actually felt the benefit.
Right. The state had a financial cushion to soften the blow. But by 2026, that cushion is completely gone.
The treasury is empty.
The treasury is empty, the currency is practically worthless, and any digital handouts the government offers are vaporized by inflation before the citizen can even spend them.
Wow.
The people simply have nothing left to give.
And when a population is completely tapped out, the social contract just shatters.
It does.
That leads us directly to the socio-political fallout. The massive protests of December 2025 and January 2026.
Right.
According to the sources, these protests were fundamentally different from prior waves of unrest, specifically because of the demographics involved. We are talking about the bazaar merchants going on strike.
This is a huge shift.
Why is that specific group turning on the government such a critical threat?
Well, the merchants and shopkeepers of the traditional bazaar, they have been the vital economic and political bedrock of the Shia clergy since the 1979 revolution.
They're the foundation.
They financed the system, and they provided its core social legitimacy. But the currency collapse in 2025 fundamentally broke their business model.
Right, because they rely on imports.
Exactly. When the Rentier loses 84% of its value, importing inventory becomes impossible. Their capital just evaporated.
So they weren't just protesting politics.
No, the merchants weren't striking solely for ideological reasons. Their actual livelihoods were being annihilated. And when the bazaar abandons the regime, it is an existential crisis. The government is losing its foundational base.
But the government's response to this was incredibly telling. They essentially deployed this class-differentiated security strategy.
They really did.
To the bazaar merchants, they offered olive branches like favorable credit lines and firing the central bank governor to appease their financial concerns.
Trying to win them back.
Right. But for the working class and the university students who were in the streets protesting the 73% food inflation, they deployed violent repression and total internet blackouts.
They tried to buy off their historical allies while violently crushing the underclass.
Yeah.
But even as they struggled to contain those internal fires, the brittle nature of this entire economic system was exposed by an external shock.
The February 2026 war with the U.S. and Israel.
Yes. The military strikes during that conflict didn't just target missile silos or military bases. They specifically hit the load-bearing sectors of the non-oil economy.
The sources state these strikes knocked out 25 to 30% of the national steel output. They severely damaged massive facilities like the Mobarka Steel Company, along with major petrochemical plants.
Massive damage.
I want to unpack the ripple effect of that. How does losing a steel plant paralyze something completely unrelated, like agriculture or consumer goods?
Well, because steel and petrochemicals are Iran's primary sources of hard foreign currency outside of oil. It is how they earn the international money required to participate in global trade. When you knock out a quarter of that production capacity, the influx of foreign currency just plummets.
And without that foreign currency,
you cannot import specialized industrial parts for automotive manufacturing, and you cannot import the heavy machinery, the seeds, or the fertilizers that are essential for agriculture.
Wow.
The disruption instantly cascades through every single supply chain that relies on imports.
So essentially, the engine of the economy was already on fire from decades of corruption. The steering wheel came off during the currency collapse, and 2026 war just blew out the tires.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. The external strikes didn't cause the systemic rot. They simply exposed a foundation that the termites had already finished hollowing out.
So bringing this all back to you listening, why dedicate this time to understanding the granular nuances of Iranian fiscal policy?
Good question.
Because this goes far beyond one country. The data you shared with us provides this terrifyingly clear masterclass in what economists call extractive institutions. When an economic and political system is engineered not to foster innovation or build sustainable infrastructure or protect the middle class, but rather to legally concentrate wealth and power among an unaccountable elite, it eventually consumes itself.
It always does.
It is the tragedy of a nation with a highly educated workforce, vast natural resources, and immense historical potential being systematically dismantled from the inside out.
And if we look beyond the current data, a really profound question emerges about the future.
What's that?
We've spent our time today dissecting the mechanics of the structural collapse that has already occurred. But what happens to the architecture of power tomorrow?
Okay.
Think about the youth in Iran today. This is a generation that has only ever known hyperinflation, isolation, and an economy designed to exclude them.
That's a huge portion of the population.
It is. And when this generation inevitably inherits the remnants of this parallel empire, will the very structures the regime built to preserve its power be the exact things that ensure its ultimate bankruptcy?
That is a heavy, lingering thought to walk away with, because once a foundation is entirely gone, you can't just patch the roof. The whole structure demands a new beginning.
It really does.
Thank you so much for trusting us with these sources and joining us on this deep dive. We hope it helped you cut through the noise and understand the mechanics beneath the headlines. Until our next exploration, keep asking the hard questions and take care.